Welcome back to Talk the Walk with me, Sarah Wong. I'm with Chris Fenton, author of the book Feeding the Dragon. He is also a trustee of U.S. Asia Institute. Thank you very much, Chris, for coming on to Talk the Walk.
Thanks for having me.
We're just talking about how the dynamics between, the Chinese authorities and the global film industry in general, and how does that play out, and what's the trickling down impact on actual celebrities and the Chinese population. And you mentioned the Disney film Mulan before the break, and I want to talk about this because we know that recently the Beijing authority, the central government, also banned the filming of a Marvel film called Shang-Chi, which starred a Canadian Chinese actor in the movie. So what does everything Mulan, Shang-Chi, what does that tell us, Beijing's attitude and the priorities of its campaign to promote China's soft power globally? Because that's one of the priorities that's been occupying the Chinese authorities' mind. But by doing this, does that help their cause?
Well, you have to remember, we talked about keeping 1.4 billion people just happy enough they don't revolt. And part of that is pulling them into the middle class. So one of the things that I was a part of as a cog in the wheel was the Hollywood exchange with China in the early days around the turn of the century up until now. A lot of that had to do with learning the fact that the Chinese government wasn't all that interested in just letting Hollywood bring their product into the country just to let their consumer spend the money and send it back to Hollywood. Instead of wanting Hollywood to give fish to the population, they wanted Hollywood to teach the population how to fish. And the reason for that is that Chinese government wanted to create its own film industry, one that would cater to its own population as far as consumers, but another that would also create the content that was catering to those consumers and build a middle class infrastructure that was part of the skill set that was doing just that. And Hollywood did an amazing job. You see over my shoulder, you see Iron Man 3, you see the Looper poster. Those were two movies that we shot partially in China using Chinese crews, having those crew members become proteges to Hollywood skill players that came in and mentored them and taught them the craft of making movies at a world-class level. Cut to today, now Hollywood is losing market share year after year. We had an 80% market share back in 2010, 2011. It has dropped to under 10% this year, and it has been a steady decline. The reason for that is we have created this film industry that now imitates what we do as best in the world. Yet, on top of it, China's creating content that is completely relevant to its consumer. So they're making high-class, high-quality product that is also very relevant to their consumer, and that's why we're losing market share. So if you're the Chinese government, you're going, we don't need Hollywood movies anymore to fill the seats of these theaters that are a big part of the real estate infrastructure that we've been spending money on. Now Chinese industry films can do that themselves. So why are we letting in Western forms of propaganda into our country when we no longer need it? And that's what Hollywood is facing today. The risk reward of trying to cater to get into China is no longer paying off. And that is a big reason why.
It seems like, as you mentioned, the Hollywood industry, they're pondering the price to pay to crack into the Chinese market, the Chinese film market is getting higher. The stake is getting higher and higher. The price is higher and higher. And in the Shang-Chi movie we mentioned, because I watched this in the theater in Hong Kong, they filmed it in Macau, part of it, and that's the special administrative region in China. It seems like they're making very conciliatory gestures, but they didn't get the reward they intended in return. So what price should the Hollywood pay, and are they willing to pay to continue to warming up to Chinese business and to forging a closer tie with Chinese market? Or this is not going to happen in the future?
Well, look, I mean, there's certain things that you expect are going to win the hearts of the Chinese government and put the wind beer back. But Macau was something that we always, I mean, just using Shang-Chi as an example, Macau was always an example of a location lots of people would bring up for movies. And we were always very determined not to use Macau, mainly because it was a one country, two system, region of the country. But on top of that, it was affiliated with gambling, which was something that the Chinese government didn't really want to promote inside the PRC borders. So that made us very reticent about Macau. Number two is this idea, for instance, if you go back to Milan, that you can take an IP, an intellectual property, or a legend or a mythology that is inherently Chinese, and as a US studio, a bastion of free speech from the West out of Hollywood, can come and make the Hollywood version better than the Chinese people of their own Chinese mythology. That's a little bit of American hubris. And I think that worked against Disney, unfortunately, in the case of Mulan. Shang-Chi, I would argue, was a much better. I mean, Kevin Feige, who I had the privilege of working with, who runs Marvel on Iron Man 3, is truly a genius and really is a master of his craft. And I think he really had the best intentions with Shang-Chi. But if you see what the problem with Shang-Chi is, it's probably deeper than that one movie. It actually goes back to Chloe Zhao, the filmmaker who came under the microscope of the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, for what she said back in 2013 in terms of releasing Nomadland in the PRC, and that did not happen. And now she's a part of the Marvel identity, part of the Marvel brand in this next movie, Eternals, which once again does not have a release date in China. And Shang-Chi might have been part of just the shrapnel of that whole geopolitical mess. So this is just once again showing how complicated, how very, very hard to determine the risk reward calculation is for Hollywood when it comes to China. And at some point, Hollywood's going to probably give up on it, because you also have consumer sentiment in China that's becoming more nationalistic and anti-American. And you also have the rest of the world that's having a problem with what Hollywood's doing to kowtow to China just to get its product in. So you have sort of this vice that's crushing Hollywood and trying to get them to go one way or another across the Pacific. So it'll be interesting to see who wins this battle.
Yeah, on that note, I want to ask you this. How much do you think that geopolitical tensions and nation-to-nation politics actually stand in the way of business profits? Because I'm sure you touch on that in your book, because your book talk about Hollywood, the NBA, and American business. And we all know that the saga between the NBA and the Chinese government, because some controversial remarks was made. But the hard truth of business interests is that political slogans destined to be nothing more than a facade in front of entrenched commercial profits. You know, Chinese audience, Chinese basketball fans, they need to watch the NBA games, and that could hurt. To stop them from doing that could hurt the authority. What do you think about that?
Well, there's a lot to cover there. So geopolitical issues 100% affect the day-to-day business. It's almost like a storm of the gods, you know, throwing lightning bolts and hail coming down on people like me who are just a cog in the wheel of different businesses and industries. So we always have to watch what's happening up here because it's affecting what we're doing down here. The second thing you brought up, which is the NBA, well, Daryl Morey did make those tweets. You said that the problem sort of went away, but it didn't actually, because Daryl Morey's tweet kept the NBA off of CCTV from well more than a year. And then on top of it, it only came back on CCTV for, I think, a couple final games. Then Daryl Morey got fired. Then he got rehired by the 76ers. Both the Houston Rockets and the Philadelphia 76ers don't even don't mean anything. They're completely disappeared in the China market. And then today, Enes Kanter of the Boston Celtics said something that was very pro-Tibet, and immediately the Boston Celtics got wiped off the map in China. So we have major issues when it comes to the NBA. And one thing we've learned about the Chinese government is, well, China's been around for 5,000 years, and the Chinese government has a very long memory. If they want to hold a grudge and penalize companies or individuals, Richard Gere, for instance, they can penalize them for as long as any of these things exist. And that is one of the big issues about the retaliation that a lot of companies and individuals face if they want to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, you know, that's the thing about the one-party system. The policy and the grudge persist continuously. All right, thank you very much, Chris, for joining us today. Appreciate you coming on to share your insights and your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back to Hong Kong very soon.
Same here.